Thank you.
Thank you. I'm excited to hear it too. So, but I mean, first of all, some disclaimers are in order. Andreas, you're extremely kind in your introduction. I'm not a scientist. I mean, I'm conversant with the sciences. I've studied. I published in physics journals, but I do not consider myself a scientist. So I want to mea culpa. Please forgive me for my sins. I want to intervene in what I think is an emergent science, right? A new science devoted finally, right, exclusively to the problem of UAP. So I kind of want to actively intervene in the emergence of that science and help it kind of come into existence. So I want to play sort of the Socratic midwife, as it were, to help this thing come into existence finally. And that's how I would say I was motivated to reach out to colleagues and to form the necessary academic structures that are required in order to stabilize such a thing, not only for the sciences, but also more generally for the scholarship that is focused on UAP and the question of how to study it. So good afternoon. Thank you, Andreas, again very kindly for inviting me to give this colloquium today. I'm deeply honored. I don't really feel that I have this that I merit this yet, but I am excited nonetheless. So first, I want to apologize to you and to colleagues. I mean, in here, given my predilections in the philosophy of science, I don't have much in the way of original ground level research on UAP to present to you. I operate more with a concern for the sort of methodological and in general the more meta-theoretic questions that are preliminary to a concerted and rigorous and serious scholarly attempt to study UAP, but empirically, right? Which I think is something that is, as I said, is emerging. And possibly the points I want to make, unfortunately, are rather elementary or obvious, but as philosophers like to do, we return to the obvious and perhaps alienate ourselves from the obvious in order to see it for what it perhaps ought to be rather than what we think it is. So what I do have today are some hopefully foundational and preliminary observations. I don't want to overstate things, but and sometimes I have complaints which point, I think, the way toward much for research on the full range of phenomena, which we group together under the heading of, today, UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, or now, I think, more interestingly enough, especially for us here, talking about anomalistics, unidentified anomalous phenomena. What I think is needed, and I'm not, of course, original here. Many people have observed this, Andreas, you as well, in print. I've been reading your work, and the work of your colleagues at IGPP and at the Journal of Anomalistics with much interest. What I think is needed is much in the way of preliminary philosophical and especially methodological analysis in order to clear a path, a trajectory, if you will, from what has been said and researched and studied regarding these phenomena in the past, and what we might study and how, which is crucial, we might study it going forward. And here is where the point I want to begin our methodological sort of meditations. I think that we are at a crucial a crossroads, a kind of a juncture, right? Now that, especially since last year, a number of seemingly highly credible individuals from within the military, most prominent, of course, of which is Mr. David Grush with his claims of crash retrievals, bodies, and the like, have come forth to tell us either what it is that they themselves have witnessed. Former Commander David Fravor's Nimitz testimony, of course, was particularly compelling. for various reasons, or else what information they were privy to relevant to the question of the basic reality of these phenomena. And that's kind of the point at which I want to withdraw and stop. And this is the point where I think we are today, right? We are transitioning away from the cul-de-sac of, the sort of loop of reality denial and default dismissal for UAP, or what were in former days, of course, called UFOs, to the acknowledgement, and here's where now we have to be careful, crucial, acknowledgement of a certain basic reality to these phenomena, right? Most visibly and most strikingly, of course, by the US military itself, first through its officers' seemingly unimpeachable eyewitness testimony, on the one hand, and then through its own official sort of admissions on the other, right? In confirming, for example, the authenticity, at least the possession of these videos that seem to display phenomena with presumably anomalous characteristics, which of course has been subjected to various analyses across the spectrum, right? Both dismissive and more accepting. We seem, that is, to be moving beyond the realm of the myth and the mystery of UFOs, to borrow from Thomas Bullard's classic and, in my opinion, seminal study from 2000, I think it was 15. We're moving away from this to their reality, to some basic reality. Right? It is a trajectory fraught with the social, epistemological complications that other seemingly anomalous phenomena have had to endure before they became part of the accepted range of phenomena that we study in nature. Right? One, of course, thinks here of, there's a classic paper in the Sociology of Science, I think it's from 1974, by Ron Westrom, right, who discussed, in the history of science, one of the most famous cases, the meteorite controversy of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which my colleague at the Society and who is also one of the lead members of Harvard's Galileo Project, this is something that he's working on, that I'm working on with him partially as well, and which he's bringing to the attention of the new community of scientific researchers, which are forming right around the UAP question, in order to point out that, the kinds of issues that we face in just getting the scientific community to accept and acknowledge that there is a basic reality to be pursued in a forward-looking prospective manner, which I'll talk about later, which is a crucial difference from what I will call the classical ufological tradition, which is usually sort of caught up in forensics and the various methodological challenges that any forensic investigation has to face. There have been other cases, like the meteorite controversy, in which even the very notion that it was possible was rejected, right, by prominent scientists of the day, who would say that things like rocks do not fall out of the sky, right? And there are various intricate sociological and also internal conceptual reasons having to do with the lack of a sort of a conceptual framework that allows that to be a possibility in nature. But also the sociological complications of receiving observational reports, right, from non-experts, right, from the folk tradition, as it were. These are all of the complications. We've seen it before in the history of science, and arguably right now, right, well, not arguably, I think really clearly we're seeing it now with the UAP question, right, and many other issues, perhaps most troublingly in the world of parapsychology. Right? So this is something we have to deal with, we have to face. I think of it as a good thing that there is this filter, that there is this resistance, and it is only more, I think, responsibility on the part of those of us who are attempting to approach the question with rigor and scholarship, to have to be able to negotiate these sociological external and internal realities, right? The lack of a conceptual framework, internally speaking, on the one hand, and the sociological challenges of the default assumption of that conventional explanations could be had for the whole range of UAP, therefore licensing their dismissal. Okay, so so as UAP become an acknowledged reality, that there is some very basic but nonetheless still puzzling there, right, to be studied carefully, as even NASA has now acknowledged in their significant but ultimately ambiguous independent study released 1 year ago. We must wonder, right, what exactly a reality here is being acknowledged, right? Because, here is where we have to negotiate between, those of us who have studied the literature, such as it is, and we have to worry about its nature, its quality, right, from a meta-theoretic perspective, which there is a lot to say about that. But for those of us who have read the literature and who come away from that convinced that at least prima facie, there is a real phenomenon here, we have to negotiate between that perspective, which for various reasons we have come to on our own, through our own study, versus what it is possible that a mainstream thinker is licensed to believe, given that they're embedded in a particular social structure and are therefore beholden by certain implicit or explicit expectations of the community, of the knowledge community, right? The discourse of knowledge and so on. We could do a Lacanian analysis, right? So we have to sort of just accept that that's a reality, that the mainstream, that there is always this kind of differentiation between the accepted sort of structure of reality that's promulgated at the university level in the discourse of knowledge, or the discourse of the university, versus the excessive remainder that exceeds the domain of that accepted reality. And that's a fate that we all, I don't think there's a way out of that kind of a situation. There's always a non-coincidence between these things. And that's what keeps, I think, things interesting, right? That's what is, I think, the fuel for epistemic. If there is any progress, that's kind of that non-coincidence, I think, in some sense, perhaps I'm being too much of a Hegelian here, that non-coincidence is kind of a driving force for, I think, progress. So we need, I almost sound like Adorno, we need the opposition in order for us to produce something intelligible and epistemically valuable, in my opinion. But in any case, if we come already from the point of view of the historical engagement with the subject, here's where I want to worry a little bit. That is, if we already come to the reality question of UAP from the standpoint of what I would like to call classical ufology, then we come to the reality issue already primed to accept and to worry that UAP are much more than apparently anomalous blips on radar or smooth tic-tac-like candies with incredible kinematic capabilities, as in the now famous 2004 Nimitz case. Right? We accept that not only are UAP objects manifesting apparently extraordinary physical characteristics that can, it would seem, be captured on the instrumentation currently known in the sciences, but we also accept that they are the subject, in some particularly interesting cases, of exceptional experiences had by witnesses of them. Thus, we may study these phenomena as objects, but we also may study the subjects who experience them, right? This is the basic sort of distinction. Yet, if we are adopting the standpoint of classical ufology, then, and here is our first epistemological quandary, we are reliant upon a certain evidentiary basis for that acceptance. Okay? It is important to realize here, and this has significance for the transition, I want to argue, from the myth and mystery to the reality, of the question of the reality of these phenomena, that in classical ufology, it is in fact, and this is again this is not an original observation of myself, this is something that has been long said in the field from very early on, it is in fact not the reality of these phenomena. It is not in classical ufology UAP themselves that are actually studied. Rather, as ufologists like J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée were themselves to admit early in the development of this classical ufological tradition, we are most often primarily dealing with a report of these phenomena and not the phenomena themselves. And this may be an interesting difference between, ufology, as it were, and even, the various, focuses within, the broad framework of anomalistics, like parapsychology. I mean, at least in parapsychology, you can go to to wherever the phenomena are occurring, the parapsychological phenomena are occurring, or to whom these phenomena are occurring, or from whom they appear to be manifesting in terms of PK or psi. You can at least interact with at least one half of the object of your study. Whereas in UAP, in ufology, not only was there no scientific, was and is no scientific research program established for observations and reporting of the occurrence of these phenomena on well-calibrated instruments, as I will complain about later. But you can't bring the UFO, you can't bring the thing, and you can't go and interview it. You can only interview the witness, right? And so in some sense, because of this asymmetry, right, ufology appears to easily slide right into the territory of anomalistics and to be very quickly associated with parapsychology, when in fact it's sort of due to this ephemerality of the one side of it, the sort of side of the what Hynek called the UFO experience, the side of it that appears to be an object displaying, rather curious and often extraordinary characteristics in the best of the cases, right? So there are important disanalogies here between, right, that we have to think about between ufology and parapsychology and anomalistics. So we can study these phenomena as objects, but also, and here I think is where we do begin clearly to make a pathway towards the general territory of anomalistics. We may study the subjects who experience UAP or UFOs. Yet if we are adopting the standpoint of classical ufology, then, and here is, and I said that this is our first problem, we have to realize that it's the report that we're focused on. And not the phenomena themselves. As such, we must accept the fundamental limitations, right? As many of you have know and have written about. We have to accept the very fundamental limitations that such an evidentiary basis presents us with, and the resulting rather severe limitations which the research of such phenomena has as well, especially when we wish to arrive at some more or less compelling conclusion regarding the nature and origins of those UAP that we study through the instrument of the case report, right? That the evidentiary basis for UFOs was historically the case report, confined the reality question, but the entire logic of this question, to the unfortunate loop of dismissal based on a not unreasonable, vaguely and sometimes explicitly Bayesian argument, which always weighted the likelihood of there being an extraordinary hypothesis required to explain the cause of UFO reports as very low. We are all familiar by now with the oft-quoted but frequently insufficiently analyzed formula, apparently a pure expression of a core epistemic methodological principle of scientific research, which we may never give up on, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is attributed to Sagan, although people before him have said it. You can find resonances with statements by Hume. In the 18th century, you can find even right before Sagan, perhaps Marcello Truzzi, who was involved in paranormal research to a various extent, also said something like this, right? But the problem, right, not to focus our ire too much on the formula, but the problem here has always been that the quote evidence was always confined to the case report and the conclusions to a retrospective forensic analysis of what had essentially become a cold case for which the activity in question, that is of the UFO, was no longer present, and where the memories and recollections of witnesses after the fact were, for the most part, the primary source of the apparently, quote, extraordinary claims. And we note that in most cases, even the radar evidence was given to us as a recollection of a witness to the information displayed on the instrument. I mean, in some cases, we have, thank God, we have some printout of the radar data. I mean, I can think of the 1986 Japan Airlines case witnessed by Captain Takeuchi and his crew, who were transporting, actually, I think it was a cargo of wine from France as they were approaching over Alaska, right? They see this, he reports that he sees this enormous, somewhat vague outline of an object, and so on. But there is actually one of the FAA officials that was involved in that case in November of 1986 tells us, but Callahan, I think his name was, he died not too long ago. He actually managed to print out, then it would be a sort of a dot matrix printout of the actual radar returns from which you could then make certain calculations, right? And then there was, of course, a study by the FAA in Atlantic City, presumably using, I've never read the actual, I don't know if you can actually get the FAA report. There's just the conclusion that was issued. But you actually have that radar evidence. But even there, right, the question always is, was the instrument functioning, and so on and so forth. And by the time that the FAA in January of 1987 and February of 1987 get a hold of it, and essentially it's a kind of a cold case, the equipment, I don't believe, was specifically tested, because this was in Atlantic City and the thing was happening in Alaska. Although the other elements of the case suggest, right, that it's probably not instrument error. The pilots on board reported tuning their weather radar to the object and getting a return that seemed to be consistent with what the ground radar operator was seeing on their scope, who then also calls NORAD and gets an officer. In fact, you can hear the conversation. There is a recording of that conversation between the FAA tower and the NORAD officer, confirming that, in fact, there was a target in precisely that region. But the point is that, in some cases, rare though they may be, we do have some non-first person instrument observations that are, presumably anomalous. For example, on this particular case, there was a further study of that data done by Daniel Kuhn, who was formerly of the Niels Bohr Institute, a theoretical particle physicist, who looked at that data and his calculations. He, in fact, graphed the spatiotemporal movement of the thing. And from that, he was able to extract certain, physical properties, kinematics, velocity, accelerations, which were completely extraordinary, right? I mean, the object was doing 10,000 Gs and so on, if the data was accurate. Anyway, but even in this case, often, except in some cases, we don't have actual access to the data itself, but rather a recollection of something that is a non-first person data. This was the case in the Nimitz, right? All of what we know from the 2004, strike carrier group Nimitz case, which now is very famous, all really of what we know is our recollection, all of what we know in terms of the sort of radar information from which we can extract certain calculations, all of that, right, is a product of the recollections of a few individuals that were involved, right? So in a sense, it's witness testimony. Again, We don't have access to the instruments. We don't have access to the actual first order data. But back to the main point. So in the typical classical ufological investigation, we are entirely confined to this kind of a context of evidence, right? Very fraught, very incomplete, and exclusively, in many ways, exclusively focused on eyewitness testimony, right? Which is fine to a certain extent, but it's limited. The conclusions from which one can, the conclusions that one can draw from such evidence are going to be necessarily inconclusive in a way, right? They may suggest certain interesting and extraordinary possibilities, but of course, ultimately, in terms of the stricter standards of an observational science that is prepared to observe phenomena with these kinds of physical characteristics, we don't really have anything like that. We haven't had any. We really haven't had that, right, in 80 years. So if you examine the history here, right, what you will find is that the attempts made to produce the evidence, extraordinary or not, were nothing more than retrospective forensic investigations of witnesses and remnants now gone cold. The scene of the crime vacated and left chillingly devoid of clear signals. Suggestive, yes, but not definitive. Even the infamous Condon study, if you go back to that, right, and read, for example, read Roy Craig's, autobiographical reflections of his time on the Condon study, and all it really was a not particularly well designed, classical ufological cold case goose hunt, goose chase, an event would happen, 4:00 in the morning. Roy would get a call from some other, official in the Condon report, and they would put him on the next flight, and he would go and do the whole, the hunt, right? The evidence collecting, which is fine. I mean, I'm not saying that this is bad, but this was the framework, right? The serious framework that the Condon study seemed to think would produce an answer as to whether these phenomena merited further investigation. And as it turns out, even by their own standards, there were a number of cases that had sufficient evidence on which one should have been able to make a reliable inference or resolution, but which no resolution was forthcoming, which of course suggests the need, right, for exactly what Condon ultimately says you didn't need, which was a rigorously well-funded, right, scientific study ongoing. So even the infamous Condon study was really little more than perhaps even just a slightly more elaborate and at that time more well-funded forensic cold case chase with investigators arriving at the scene after the facts have gone cold. In such a situation, the witness testimony rises to the fore and becomes the leading indicator of what it was that had occurred. Unsurprisingly, if this was all the evidence produced, lacking in almost every case, independent, well-calibrated, multimodal, instrumented observations, sufficiently coordinated as to triangulate a clear trajectory, for the anomalous object seen, from which kinematical and other key physical properties can be derived, then it was always going to be insufficiently convincing, especially to those outside, right, in the mainstream community, who are operating on the default assumption that one should always preference the most conventional above all other possibilities. Right? It's the Bayesian priors argument, which is not it's not unreasonable to think that. So, especially if eyewitness, that is to say, subjective testimony is always treated with suspicion, as it is in the scientific world, right? Especially, it's not without justification. It is well known, right, that it is unreliable. But it does count for something. And I want to think about exactly what that something is. But of course, stepping back even from that skeptical recoil right? When one realizes that the fundaments of the evidence here are fraught, incomplete, inaccessible frequently. If it's a military context, often hidden behind firewalls of national security, as we see today with the claims of Grush and others. Once stepping back from that, even from that skeptical, recoiling from the recoilism, we have to admit, though, right, on balance, that logic is sort of absurdly circular, right? And I think one of our colleagues, Michael Bolender here, has of course pointed this out, right, in a legal or juridical context, right? A lot of the evidence that you see in some of the best cases would pass muster if the standards imposed were not those of strictly observational experimental science, which you don't have because you never set the framework in place in order to produce that evidence in 80 years, right? And this is part of the loop. But on balance, right, in a court of law, for example, a lot of the best of the cases would have been enough to establish not only the reality of the phenomena, that there's a there, but that there's something particularly anomalous that does beg for scientific study, even so. So the logic is, in fact, this logic of dismissal is, of course, absurdly circular if it is not actually even confused. One cannot expect a secure conclusion to be reached regarding the specific nature or origins, or even the cause of UFO reports, if one has in mind the stricter standards of the observational experimental sciences. You can't reject it on the basis of those criteria unless such a system is in place. But that's the point, is what would merit or what would compel such a scientific research program to be put in place, right? Which could give us the evidence on which we would be able to reject or accept the reality, right? You see the loop. So, but also one can't, only on the basis of case reports, which are simply consistent with some mundane or conventional explanation, dismiss the reality of these phenomena as meriting further scientific study, as I said. Yet that is precisely what happened throughout the fraught history of what I call classical ufology. Poor quality evidence in a strict sense, primarily reliant on witness testimony, even if of instrumented observations by trained witnesses, cannot lead to a definitive conclusion as to the nature, origins, or causes of a UFO report. But it also cannot be used, mutatis mutandis, to simply dismiss the reality of these phenomena as not meriting further study, right? As the Condon report concluded. And this is the key point right here that I'm kind of harping on this, but this is the key point in the transition from the myth and mystery of these phenomena to the question of their specific reality. Not that there's just a there, but what is the there, right? There has never been, and I say this, right? There has never been a sustained transgender, and I'm not the only one who's observed this. Many people have said it. There has never been a sustained transgenerational scientific research program stabilized within contemporary university systems across the globe, by the way, that is solely devoted to producing the requisite data on which firmer, more unassailable conclusions might be drawn. Indeed, what seems to have been missed, although Hynek was well aware of this, was a simple methodological point that the UFO case reports do, in fact, contain sufficient information to establish a clear phenomenological pattern that warrants further study without there having to be any definite conclusion regarding the specific nature, origins, or causes of the UFO from the forensic investigation of these case reports. It's a crucial point, right? A crucial distinction. And this is exactly the point that UAP researcher, my colleague Wes Waters at the Galileo Project, makes with his colleagues in their seminal UAP research methods paper of 2023, right, which I encourage everyone to read. It's a 70-page paper. That the UFO case reports, stemming from what they call a gray literature, right, of inconsistent, highly variable informational quality, something we have to readily admit, of course, if we're to be honest, right? These are the sort of, it's kind of a folk It's kind of this folk tradition of passing on stories, right, about UFOs. This only constitutes the basis for research design, not the basis for firm conclusions regarding the specific reality of these phenomena, which in each case may stem from a variety of causes to which, because there is no rigorous research framework in place, to which we have no access to the causes, simply don't. In medicine, as this paper, as Waters et al. 2023 points out, in medicine, what we might call the folk reports of disease, right, often clusters of signs and symptoms indicative of an ailment that might get a unifying explanation upon further investigation, are just forensic clues, and here's where forensics is really important, that point the way for a more careful, deliberate field study, looking for a potential underlying cause to explain the signs and symptoms being reported. What this means, of course, and this is here a very, very elementary observation, right? But I think it's worth pointing out and highlighting it. What this means is that the UAP report, which constitutes the substance of classical ufology, the UAP report, carefully documented incidents, is useful as a point of departure, not as the landing port for any generally convincing, unimpeachable conclusions regarding the nature, origins, or causes of these reports. I think the most careful ufologists are willing to admit that all that they can demonstrate is there is a reality, the specific nature, origins, and causes of which we don't have access to, which just simply calls for a real research program specifically anticipating such a kind of phenomenon. So we designed the research around the clusters of signs and symptoms and construct the relevant instrumentation that is prospectively, not retrospectively, but prospectively calibrated to receive data within the phenomenological envelope as indicated by the case reports. So there's where, of course, the case reports, as Andreas, I think you in your 2020 paper in the N=1 text, which is really great, as you and your other colleagues have pointed out, right? Here, I think, and I'm seeing it sort of from this distinction between, the case report study in a forensic modality versus what I want to call the new science of UAP, which is prospective and anticipatory, and actually adopting the stricter framework of observational science. The case report is very valuable for providing the phenomenological structure that then informs the specific character of the research program, which then operates independently, right, of the specific content of that case report. So the case reports, in other words, the classical ufological tradition, informs the research program, but it does not govern it. This is very, very important. Very important. Does not govern it, and it is not the basis for any firm and justifiable conclusions that could be generally accepted in the public discourse. And I guess that's an argument of mine. So the burden on researchers here, therefore, which the Galileo Project team writing this 2023 paper had taken upon themselves, is to choose the reports very carefully. I mean, you have to have, a very careful methodological or systematic approach to the choosing of the reports that constitute the various phenomenological clusters, right, that you're establishing the research program to observe. Right? And I say various clusters because, as you look deeply into the best documented cases, right, it's clear that yes, there is a UAP there, but yet what is that exactly? Well, it's a cluster of signs and symptoms that in fact there's maybe something, right, much more specific to distinguish when one starts to look at the phenomenological disclosure of the reality of these things to the witnesses and the instruments and so on. So one has to be very careful, and this is perhaps where the tradition of philosophy, the phenomenological tradition perhaps, There is even a tradition in science of phenomenology. There's phenomenological particle physics, right? Where is the attention is focused on these emergent structures. This helps further categorize and distinguish the phenomena that we are observing to help the observers observe what they're observing so that we can then theorize better. Right? So the burden on the researchers here is to choose their reports carefully enough to establish these phenomenological clusters, these envelopes that inform the specific character of the research, observational research program that you are establishing, which then in turn, of course, determines the specific instrumentation and the regimes in which that has to be calibrated and how to coordinate these. So the multimodal, what the Galileo project calls, the multimodal, instrumented observation, right? The burden is on the researcher here is to use very, very carefully and smartly, to choose those reports carefully. And here is where credibility, relative data integrity, and so on are the key analytical principles that determine from the details of the case reports indicative of a certain phenomenological pattern, what it is exactly that we are going to attempt to record going forward. So on the reality question, this is where we are now. I argue that we are just now, after in fact 80 years plus of attempts to actually study these phenomena by means of the rigorous standards of the observational sciences, we're just now in the process of setting up a research program to do just that. Motivated, informed, structurally informed by the history of classical ufology with its many detailed case reports chosen carefully, which could yield that evidence, extraordinary or not, on the basis of which we can then reason towards firmer, more unimpeachable conclusions regarding the trio, right? The nature, origins, and possibly also the causes of these UAP reports, of the UAP. We do not quite know what we will find, honestly. We know what we expect. And surely, given the general nature of UAP, we're going to find that a variety of underlying causes are in play. Right? So we can expect the new science of UAP to have to go through the growing pains of realizing that the statistics vary, that 90% upwards of all UAP incidents turn out on further analysis to be conventionally explicable. So we have to have enough historical awareness, and this is where the relationship between the new science and the classical tradition is absolutely key, because that classical tradition historically contextualizes the UAP study, so that we understand that, of course, as even has been known for decades, most UAP are going to be resolvable conventionally. But there is going to be this, this small percentage, which I like to call the recalcitrant residuum, which does in fact, even when there is good data, like that crucial D category in the Japan system of forensic analysis, there will be those cases for which sufficient data is available on which you would think a resolution is possible, but for which no resolution in conventional terms is forthcoming. So we don't really know what we're going to find, given that we have no history yet of this kind of prospective, anticipatory, non-forensically determined scientific research observational program will give us. But on these questions, we must wait and see how successful we can be first to even get such research programs established. So I think we have practical questions that follow from these methodological and philosophical investigations that help clear the way. After that, we have a practical thing to accomplish, which is to get these programs established firmly within the academy, to contextualize them, not only in terms of ufology, but also in terms of the history of science, which is really important to make this study legible to academics, right? So, we have to first be successful to get this stuff off the ground. and well-funded within the university system. And second, to get data from which we can begin to reason towards the conclusions that had always been sought for from the classical ufological tradition, which is caught, of course, in the forensic modality of science. On this basis, then, I would like to argue that we do not, in fact, know, actually, in a stricter sense, the extent to which UAP are anomalous, right? As a result of this distinction between the sort of forensic entrapment of ufology and its limited data versus the new science of UAP, we must admit that with respect to the new research program, which promises, right, data of a kind of integrity that can be generally accepted, with respect to that, we have no basis yet to come to a definitive conclusion about the extent to which UAP, meaning that recalcitrant residuum for which the data should be, is there, which should allow for a conventional resolution, but for which one is not forthcoming. We don't know yet, right? We don't know yet the extent and exactly how UAP are anomalous. We have a clear indication that they are, of course, from the UFO case reports of the past, as we've said. But in terms of the data, from which, from what we should call the new science, we don't have it. Instead, we are only at the point of a philosophical methodological justification to establish the research programs that can supply us with such data. We may debate whether and to what extent UFOs, or now UAP, are anomalous, but if our considerations are only confined to the report, we can clearly make little definitive progress on the phenomena. Our efforts here, however, are not in vain, since the principle is that the UFO case report does give us clues, as I've said. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, not necessarily about the specific nature, origins, or causes, but just how it is that we ought to study these phenomena and with what instruments. The challenge then is methodological first. And, that methodological challenge, clearing the way, contextualizing it, also, I think, performs a kind of a sociological intervention in allowing these phenomena to exit the realm of the dismissed fringe and be placed within at least the domain of concern, if not acceptance, of the actual mainstream sciences, observational sciences. It deserves a place. Right. So the challenge is first methodological, which I think allows us to intervene sociologically at the external on these external questions. So there's an interesting interplay between the internal conceptual analysis and foundations for the methodology, producing, I think, a philosophical license to allow the sociological forces to abate, right? It is also conceptual and philosophical, as we must be careful to detach the hypothetical. I mean, there's further philosophical and conceptual issues to be sort of tackled here as we make these distinctions between the forensic history of UFO case studies and this new science. We must be careful to detach the hypothetical speculations which arise as we become convinced one way, acceptingly or positively, or another, skeptically or negatively, as to what UAP may in fact be. Again, I have to emphasize, we don't really know the extent to which they do or do not fit into our scientific paradigm, because we don't have the scientific evidence on which we can reason to such a firm conclusion. All we have are the case reports, and they're indications of the phenomenological envelope which has to be studied. We don't have the phenomena themselves, again. I perhaps have lost my place. Yeah, so following the evidence produced from the new scientific research programs, programs plural, being established is, of course, going to be complex, as researchers will have to reconcile, of course, as I said before, with the fact that most UAP are going to turn out to be mundane. We would expect the same, however, to be true. We would expect the same to be true in new science. Thus, the first task will be to learn the structure and the extent of the mundane causes which give rise to UAP reports and what they actually look like in terms of the instrumentation, right, that we're setting up. We've got to know, right, what the hay is before we can see the needle, right, if you're doing this data gathering approach. And that's not the only approach in science, but this is the one, for example, that the Galileo project has spent a lot of time, effort, money, and tears trying to establish, right? So we have to, even with this new science, we have to go through, as it were, right, the whole stage of all of the stages of ufology. In short, when we do the new science, we have to realize that most are going to be mundane, but then presumably, although the evidence will tell us this, there is going to be a smaller subset which resists conventional explanation, which presents with extraordinary phenomenological characteristics in various observational envelopes. But so how extraordinary? And with what specific physical characteristics? Again, this is yet to be determined. We certainly know what it is that we hope to see: kinematical acrobatics, profound luminosity and electromagnetic output, transmedium travel, perhaps even observable morphological wonders, like some UAP seem to have a shape-shifting quality. One famous case that the SCU documented in 2015, 2014, the Aguadilla, Puerto Rico case on thermal imagery, seems to differentiate into two objects, right? I mean, and there are other cases that are equally, strange, things that appear, disappear, split, right? So the point here is that now we have to wait and see. But once we have this evidence, these observations, the question we face is the most important: how to explain. The question that we then face is the most important: how do we explain the evidence, right? And that's where, of course, the ufological tradition sort of goes a bit too far in terms of what really can be licensed on the basis of, forensic evidence, right? And this is where all of the speculation becomes, hypothetical speculation becomes extremely problematic, and I think very distracting, to be quite honest. Multidimensionality, you name it. Speculation on top of speculation. Here we need to pull back and allow the empirical evidence to be produced, right, in a rigorous framework. So at this stage, we have to consider, once we have that evidence, right, produced within the stricter observational context, at this stage, we move then to consider various hypotheses. However, it is crucial that we keep in mind what the physical sciences can and cannot determine by way of explanation of UAP, and what sort of understanding it could really provide us with. What classical ufology wanted was a resolution that some UFOs, or other, reported in a case, was or wasn't a fully unconventional phenomenon, exceeding our understanding of nature or even of reality, or at least of human technological engineering capacity. And surely the new science of UAP can provide evidence on the basis of which we may be able to decide between these questions. So in some sense, right, this is kind of where the new science of UAP converges, or at least where there's a union between like technoseti and the UAP, right? So in a sense, technoseti is doing what, the UAP science may be doing, but not in distant, observations, but for near Earth or intra-atmospheric observations. And that raises philosophical objections and conceptual issues that I will kind of pass over in silence, right? But here's where the things converge. So surely the new science of UAP can provide evidence on the basis of which we can decide between these kinds of questions. However, let's suppose, right, for the sake of argument, that we do find evidence that merits such conclusions, that either UAP can be clustered in terms of extraordinary natural phenomena, yet unknown to us, surely a possibility for some UAP seem to be just profoundly luminous sources, sometimes point sources, sometimes with structure, without the signature of a technology per se. You know, some of the presentations that you see in the interestingly recurrent cases from Hessdalen Valley, some of them just look like they could be interestingly strange plasma, you know, or something, you know, energetic that is clearly a function of nature, but not necessarily under any intelligent control. It could be wrong, but you know, some UAP present like that. But other UAP, like in the Nimitz case, with very good close range observations of objects, you know, in close encounters, as it were, seem to suggest that these things are technological and under some kind of an, you know, agential control, right? There's an intelligence operating there. So our, you know, the new science is capable of producing evidence on the basis of which we might be able to decide, right, between these questions, depending on how the UAP are clustered in terms of their phenomenology. Or, you know, that some, you know, UAP present as physical objects. And so then what is the question, right? So what? So you've got some radar triangulated information that produces a trajectory from which the calculations indicate speeds like what Kevin Knuth calculated using very elementary high school level physics, as he well pointed out, that anybody could do, producing speeds well in excess of, or at least in the vicinity of, re-entry speed for a meteor with no atmospheric, you know, explosion or other thermal effects detectable, you know, at least observationally. Yet, you know, 45,000 miles an hour and you know, G forces on the order of, you know, 5,000 or something, you know, well into the regime of relativistic speeds, right? Then what? Right? The task of the physical sciences is not typically to decide between these two possibilities, or if it is, and here's where we should look at what TechnoSeti is doing. If it is, it does so only to exclude the specifically technological factor in favor of a more fundamental understanding of the physical principles underlying the manifest phenomena that can disclose how these phenomena are possible, whether in terms of engineering or in terms of fundamental principles of nature, first principles. For UAP, this would mean trying to determine not whether they are necessarily technological, that is, beyond human technological capacity, but how it is possible that, whether technological or not, they come to manifest the physical properties that they do. You know, the intense luminosities, the magnetic outputs, the velocities that are observed, maybe the spectral characteristics of some of the light sources. You know, maybe they're red, you know, maybe they're blue shifted or red shifted in interesting, curious ways that suggest relativistic speed. So you know, for example, in the famous 2004 Nimitz case, which I keep referring to, for which the SCU has produced the only definitive forensic study, we find there to have been seemingly impossible kinematics, like I said, velocities well into the tens of thousands of kilometers an hour and accelerations peaking at an absurd 5,000 G forces. If we were to have had instrumented observations on well-calibrated instruments that gave us the data from which we could deduce such kinematical facts, then we might propose that it was a technology of unknown origin, surely not of human design. I mean, I don't think the Chinese have the capacity to produce an object capable of withstanding 5,000 Gs, but this is, we have to worry about that. Yes, but more importantly, we would have a physical anomaly to explain. How are such kinematics possible? I mean, by what set of physical principles is it possible to have an object with structural integrity, right, moving through, 25, 30,000 kilometers an hour and pulling 5,000 G forces and coming to a sudden stop just above the ocean without an atomic explosion, right? When it comes to a stop, I mean, Kevin calculated that the energy required that has to be on demand for accelerating the object to 5,000 Gs and then and then having it stop suddenly, right? Which is what Kevin Dave, for example, the radar operator aboard the USS Nimitz, corroborated by other radar data, indicated had happened, right? I mean, Kevin calculated that it was something like 10 times the total output of the nuclear power in the United States in a year. I mean, when Kevin gave that result last year at the Seoul conference, a plasma physicist stood up in the room and said, okay, let's just assume that this case, that the evidence is veridical. I'm not going to question it. What in the hell could be, what in the hell could be in play? Where did the energy go? It was his basic question. That's what physicists need to do, is to ask very simple questions based on these simple folk observations, right? That indicate such extraordinary kinematics. Where did the energy go? There's something called conservation of energy. Where did it go? There was no massive explosion. There was no thermal effect, it seemed. The object simply came to a stop as if its mass was kinematically irrelevant. That's an anomaly for physics. Whether it was technological or not, in some senses, it's interesting. It's important, and I think the result, that would be a profound announcement that we have well corroborated, information triangulating on an object, giving us a trajectory from which we can make such calculations. That would be a profound discovery, especially if not just one group of researchers had produced that evidence, but that, like in particle physics, right, like you had multiple other research groups who had similar instrumentation in place, with similar standards of evidence, right, so that the data is interoperable, who are producing the evidence on which then we can reason. So we don't have that. We simply don't have that. So we have these epistemic methodological challenges that sort of limit, right, our move here. But if we were to have had that, then the question, I think, becomes even more profoundly interesting, beyond the question of, who the hell is making such a thing? What intelligence is capable of doing this? How is it possible? Hynek liked to observe that it was because of such seemingly impossible indications in UFO reports that they were frequently dismissed. And here again, we come back to the loop, the tautologous loop of dismissal. As he put it, it can't be like that. Therefore, it isn't like that. That is, it's not possible. Therefore, it can't be actual. In fact, this is an unscientific reversal, as Hynek and many others have observed, including Marcello Truzzi, right, of the most basic empirical situation. Rather, we should draw on the most basic axiom of what in philosophy we call modal logic, the logic of possibility, which says that actuality implies possibility, right? That is, if something is actual, it must be possible. Therefore, the question is, how is it possible if we have actual data of such a nature? That is, this then is a question not just for science, but for fundamental science, for fundamental physics. Other people observed that perhaps UAP are actually giving us a demonstration of a kind of fundamental aspect of nature, which is operating in our blind spot. Right? We know what our blind spot is in physics, and it is precisely in between our understanding of space-time and matter. Right? There's a sense in which we don't really understand what motion is if we don't understand the relationship between matter and space and time, which is the crux of our crisis in physics today. And it would be the same even if we were to have anomalous physical samples, even biologics, as Dave Grush has now infamously stated, referring presumably to the retrieval of what should be called crashed non-human technology, piloted allegedly again by non-human beings. Now, this talk is supposed to be about the extent to which UAP can be approached as a topic in anomalistics research. And unfortunately, it seems that I have utterly avoided this question thus far, or that I am proceeding as if UAP can unproblematically be approached through relatively conventional observational and perhaps even experimental methods as currently accepted by our sciences. Yes, that is in fact true. My belief is first that any anomaly will present itself or should present itself if we establish the proper framework for capturing the relevant evidence, which hasn't existed. If we cannot do this, we cannot advance our understanding of these phenomena, and we cannot advance our sciences if these phenomena are of such a character as to merit some shift or dislocation in the existing paradigm, which indeed operates in some broadly materialist and in many cases also reductionist ways. Even so, I am convinced that at least some UAP are amenable to these methods. It might not give us the full picture, but one has to put the shovel, of course, down somewhere. We need evidence on the basis of which now, as I want to move towards the question of just the extent to which we can consider UAP a topic in anomalistics, right? More fully, more substantively. We need to at least have the basis for establishing interesting and perhaps anomalous, if not exceptional, correlations between the manifestations of these objects and the subjects who witness them or who encounter them, whether that be in the wild, in situ, or interestingly enough, whether that be in an experimental or observational context. So we also have to think, as I will say towards the end, which I am coming to shortly, we also have to be aware of the observers observing the UAP, I think, in interesting ways. That's something that typically doesn't happen, right, as we do our first order work observing the phenomena of nature, right? We don't observe the observers observing. So, and I think perhaps, especially if we're going to move into the vicinity of parapsychological frameworks of thinking about how UAP could potentially be considered as a topic in such a thing, in such a tradition, we have to start thinking in these more complex, multidimensional and meta, as Valet kind of suggested, metalogical ways. But that's something we'll talk about in a minute. So surely these physical approaches will not give us the full picture. Surely that is the case. But we don't need UAP for that. We already know, for example, in the study of mind and of human consciousness, we already know that the physical picture is not the complete picture, the full picture. So an important point as we make an approach to the question of just the extent to which UAP bear out some interesting, let me call it for the first time, mind-matter connections, we have to already keep in mind that this is a problem in science. We already know that that's a problem in science. So what we don't need to do is to compound the mind-matter problem where we focus on human consciousness by adding in prematurely, I think, without a proper approach, the question of UAP and consciousness and so on. I think we have to be careful here. So what is this full picture? If we are strict in our methodological adherence to the UFO, to the validity and the usefulness, specific usefulness as I've outlined of the UFO case report, then we must also reconcile with the fact that a certain proportion of cases do present not only with physical anomalies, but the witnesses have also sometimes extraordinary experiences during the UFO incident to which they are party. I mean, I say that, you know, with gravity, but we all know, you know, you guys all know that. You probably all read lots of stories about that, and even have met people who claim these things. I have. Sometimes, however, is not always. So it's not even clear, right, which UFO encounter or what about the encounter is correlated, right, with some kind of anomalous or exceptional human experience, now to start borrowing from the language of your colleagues at the Institute für Grenzgebiete, right? Is there an extraordinary, exceptional experience in play, right, during an UAP encounter, which suggests an interesting mind-matter or subject-object correlation that is curious, and that perhaps is anomalous, right? When that is, you know, sometimes a psi or paranormal aspect is in play, making the case clearly in scope for anomalistics. There are cases, right, in which, and frequently they are more close encounter cases. The one that probably a lot of you know about is the case, you know, of the Zimbabwe landing, to call it what it seems to have been, in where, you know, 30 to 40, perhaps upwards of 60 school children, as again, many of you may know, were witness to not only a landing, but as you see the witnesses being interviewed, these children being interviewed by John Mack, although there's a methodological question that has to be addressed there, the extent to which the information was disclosive of the structure, of the objective structure of the occurrence, that's another issue. But what it seems to be that it wasn't just a landing of a craft, but also there seems to be other craft involved, and of course, most scarily, I guess, beings sort of around the craft, and some other witnesses saying, you know, sort of running around the property, the school property in Zimbabwe in 1994. During the interviews, right, with witnesses, again, of course, we're reliant on the witness. The case is cold. It's not like you can go to the house where the poltergeist is and, like, you know, try to set up your equipment. You have to interview them, and the phenomenon is no longer active, right? According to John, I watched all of the interviews, the raw tapes. I had access from the John Mack Institute. I watched them all and took copious notes a couple of years ago. So what seems to be clear is that the description of the entities is fairly consistent. However, some of the children had what you might call a kind of telepathic connection, but it's not entirely clear, right? Of course. It's not entirely clear the extent to which that is an impression that a child under, you know, witnessing such extraordinary phenomena would have had, or whether there was some kind of direct mind-to-mind psi-mediated kind of interaction going on, in which specific content, right, was being shared. And so here, of course, is perhaps where we can motivate an understanding of exactly what was in play by looking at the parapsychological literature on the phenomenon of telepathy, and try to understand the extent to which we can believe or not whether that was in play. But whether it in fact was in play or not, right, of course, that is now lost to the cold case. So the question, you know, if we're to transition away from cold case investigation, where only we can kind of perhaps motivate our assignment of a probabilistic likelihood of there being something like psi in play, which is probably the best we can get, if we accept the parapsychological tradition as giving us information on the basis of which we can make such a judgment. We don't have any specific data that is able to allow us to correlate, you know, right, the witnesses with the UAP A and B with the beings, of course, because in this case it wasn't the UAP, right, which was the interesting correlate here. It was another being, another mind, presumably, right, to which we have no access, There's no sample, there's no creature, there's nothing. It's right, it's gone. And that's another interesting difference, that sometimes it looks like what we have are mind-matter correlations, right? So, for example, the other case I was going to talk about, which you might not have heard about, is the Dorothy Isett case. Dorothy Isett was a woman who, in the early to mid 1970s, started having these sightings of what Hynek would have classified as nocturnal lights. So it was the kind of luminous nocturnal lights phenomenon, a sort of form of UAP or UFOs. After which she was compelled by something to start photographing these luminous displays. And over the course of her life, from 1973 to, she just died in 2021 or 2022, like literally the month or two after I learned about her, I had found out also that she had died, because I was going to try to go and visit her. She was in Vancouver on the East Coast, on the West Coast of Canada. And I was in LA at the time. In any case, from the 1970s to the to the 2000s, she proceeded to record over 80,000 feet of video, live video. Dorothy presents with a case in which she seems to have some kind of anomalous experience with and outside of the experience of these luminous presentations, which suggests some kind of exceptional experience is underway. And in fact, the documentary Capturing the Light that you can find actually on Amazon, in fact, the documentarist, when he's filming her, you can see there's like UAP in the background. So she can feel when it's there, it's this kind of a interesting mind, presumably matter connection. Anyway, so if we don't yet have what is needed for UAP as physical objects, that is a framework of research that is not primarily forensic in nature, but has transitioned to a more mature, anticipatory form of scientific observation, then we surely do not have a framework in place to capture the data which is relevant for subjects of UAP incidents. That is, the witnesses and the specific character of their experience in relation to the UAP encounter. So what I would like to propose is a similar transition away from the UAP incident case report, forensic cold case chase, towards a more non-forensic anticipatory research framework, which attempts to capture data from which we may arrive at a sense as to what extent there are interesting correlations to be studied between the witnesses and the UAP. And I want to insert an interesting possibility here, is that as we set up the framework of academic science, wouldn't it not be interesting to have a meta study studying the study, right? Studying the observers, from which potentially, we don't have to say that this is the case, but from which potentially interesting correlations between their observations and their experiences could potentially be gleaned. In any case, I will abandon, as Borges said, novels are never completed, they're abandoned, so I will simply abandon the talk. Thank you.